speaker, who's Dr. Margaret Cullen, the founder and principal of Think Governance Limited, specialist in the area of corporate and investment fund governance. Margaret holds a PhD in governance from University College Dublin and has extensive board and committee experience, including currently as board chair and audit committee chair, and previously as a remuneration committee chair. She's been an assistant professor at the UCD Smurfit Business School since 2007, lecturing in professional diploma in corporate governance in various subject areas, and since 2020 has been lecturing on the responsibilities of the board, currently co-academic director of the Institute of Bankers Certified Bank Director Programme, and lectures on bank governance, and a board assessor with the Institute of Directors of Ireland. So a huge amount of experience to draw on in relation to this area, which is ESG and the green investor. So I'm delighted to have Margaret. Margaret.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Delighted to be here. And I empathised with Ken earlier about the suit. I entered COVID in my 40s. I left in my 50s. And the eyesight is went from long-sighted to short-sighted. And it does vary day by day. So bear with me. Okay. I did not dress for success. So I'm carrying my little thing here. But anyway, we'll figure that out. So look, I think Kevin said at the outset, the opinions expressed today are pretty much my own, and very much where my approach to corporate governance is to join the ecosystem. And very often, as I go through different forums and different classes, whether it's teaching bank directors who are trying to deliver on the EU Action Plan, and also trying to be compliant with EBA guidelines and ultimately ESB guidelines, in engagement with you, the corporates, to the investor world, to the pure corporate governance world, from listed company to SME, the tendency sometimes is to focus on your silo. I think it's very important that we understand that the world is inextricably linked and everything's linked up. And one of the things that I suppose is a plus about the EU Action Plan that we can look at later, and particularly the investor's role in it, is that it's seeking to do that in some way. Okay, so hopefully it will clicker. So just in terms of, I want to kind of go back a little bit to basics a little bit. I want to talk about the concept of stewardship leading into responsible investing, and also talk about the EU Action Plan and the role for asset managers and institutional investors. But asset managers, let's call it what it is, asset managers that engage directly with listed companies, their role as carved out within that plan, and what I'm seeing as the evolving nature of investing, company stewardship, and so on. Okay, so I'll start with excuse me, I'm over eager on this clicker here, excuse me. I'll start with the idea of stewardship. Stewardship is something that's very close to my heart, and it's a term that we will often hear, whether, directors are stewards of companies. When I'm talking about stewardship here, I'm talking about the role of investors in investee companies and the role of the investors as regards stewarding the companies in which they invest. Okay, so one of the things I suppose that is very important to understand is that the world's changed post-2008, because the big question that was called out was, where were the investors? Where were the investors pre-2008, particularly in relation to the investors in banks, where return on equity could only be generated with a significant deviance between risk appetite and strategy. In other words, a lack of alignment between, a risk tolerance / appetite and strategy. So that was one aspect to it. And what we saw then, whether it's through the separation of the Stewardship Code from the UK Corporate Governance Code, formerly the Combined Code, out to a code in its own right, and subsequently through the shareholder rights requirements and thereafter, we're seeing this evolution of stewardship and an enhanced expectation on asset managers, asset owners, and institutional investors who invest directly in companies to be better stewards of the companies which they invest. My mantra in that regard would be my same mantra to INEDs, nose in, finger out. You can't run the company. You have to understand what the limitations of that are and use your position in an effective way. And I've seen stewardship done really, really poorly. Kevin would have sat in my class in relation, and Lisa, in relation to exec remuneration. They'd know my feelings on that, aspects where I think we still continue to get it wrong. But nonetheless, we're seeing this area evolve. So I'm just giving you, I won't read it out in its entirety. You can look at the slides later. But the Shareholder Requirements Directive calls out this important role and says, look, we need to move away from that short-term focused return, and which may lead to suboptimal corporate governance and performance. And we know that we've case after case. I'll never be out of a job because every time I turn up in Smurfit Business School, every single year, I have a new case, and it's great. But speak from that perspective, but not great because we're not seeing that evolve. But I also wanted to quote Andrew Bailey, who I thought was right on the money when he talked about stewardship as a function of an asset manager's responsibilities towards its investors. So in other words, going in there, don't be looking at the short term, even the medium term, as a sustainable investment, as a long-term sustainable investment. Ken was right on the money. We want investors, obviously there'll be people who are thinking of the short term, but particularly in those Article 9 funds and those sustainable funds, we're looking for that long-term horizon and that long-term to transition towards net zero, enabling delivery of the EU action plan. So, it's part of the market integrity agenda too. And I thought that Andrew Bailey put that very well. Okay, but in defining stewardship, the FRC, right on the money again, defining stewardship as the responsible allocation, management and oversight of capital to create sustainable value for clients and beneficiaries, leading to sustainable benefits for the economy, the environment and society. And this was the last iteration of the Stewardship Code, which was revised in 2020, and suddenly we see that ESG appear. So really that socialization of ESG factors into the definition of stewardship. So stewardship for me has always been on the agenda, but now we're seeing that integration into, what are you doing in terms of whether it's through moral suasion, how are you engaging? Engaging is the key thing. And I was really taken by what Ken was saying this morning, because my biggest concern in all that's going on in the world with SFDR and so on is that we lose that qualitative assessment, that we lose that engagement where we have pragmatic discussions about the transition of investee companies and what they're trying to achieve. What are the barriers to those achievements? Are they acceptable? From a corporate governance point of view, we've been living in comply or explain for a long time. We can't abdicate responsibility through compliance by explanation. However, I think that we need to take a pragmatic approach when things like the war in Ukraine, COVID come along that can derail us. Okay. So let's look at a definition of responsible investment. I hope to God I can read this, but PRI defines responsible investing as a strategy and practice to incorporate environmental, social and governance factors in investment decisions and active ownership. The PRI, very, very close to, obviously, United Nations, very much aligned to the notion of the SDGs and so on. And they just classify the 3 dimensions of ESG. And you'll see here, when you look at it, I'm going to have to look to my left here because it's so small, environment, climate change, etc., all the things that we've talked about, the social dimension, human rights, modern slavery, child labour, working conditions, employee conditions and employee relations. But of course, as Ken has alluded to it earlier, when the social taxonomy lands, I suspect it will be much broader than that. It could go to as far as your social footprint, the impact of your activities on society, recognising that there is beautiful empirical evidence coming out from the academic world demonstrating the relationship between environmental footprint and societal footprint, and the correlation relationship between the two. And of course, there's governance. Now, I may as well throw it out there, and I'm conscious of time and I'm a notoriously bad timekeeper, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. When we talk about ESG, I'm not a lover of the acronym. I'm not a lover about G being relegated to the third point. And the reason I'm not is that what I'm seeing, even in the investor world, is the concept of governance being relegated to kind of 3 or 4 very measurable aspects, like gender diversity on a board, or cultural diversity, or other aspects, or a long-term incentive plan that incorporates ESG and so on. The corporate is the leader, the governance is the leader. Remember, corporate governance is about direction and control. It's about the strategy that you want to execute and the risk environment, the risk and control environment you generate to do that. It's about encompassing and putting your arms around all the key stakeholders. So for me, it is the G that is the driver of the E&S. And I always wanted to remind that, particularly if I've got companies in front of me, to remind them that don't allow a focus on a narrow definition of G. G is the essence of this. And I would hope that if I'm talking to my grandchildren, I hope that we won't be for a while, but I hope when I am talking to my grandchildren that we will actually not be talking about ESG or indeed CSR, that we will have socialised these aspects into the way we do our business. And I agree with Ken. I was in Smurfit Business School last night talking about the invisible hand and Adam Smith and saying, if the invisible hand, if Adam Smith, who really wanted the wealth of nations to be read in tandem with the theory of moral sentiments, in other words, be self-serving and actually be self-sufficient and then, generate product, trade that product and we all win. But he also said, do it in an ethical way, think of the wider stakeholder. And I think that the invisible hand, as envisaged by Adam Smith, probably hasn't worked, hence the layer of regulation. Okay, but nonetheless, you get the sense here from responsible investing. This is the idea, incorporating those factors, encouraging investors to say, asset managers, asset owners, institutional investors to say, okay, I'm going to channel this, my the funding I have into sustainable investments towards some really important global goals on environment. So just in terms of the definition and responsible investing, again, far too tiny. I don't know what I was thinking. But while not a guiding regulation, the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, it is the world leading proponent for responsible investing. So we talked about, loads of different guidelines, but the PRI has been called out. It's in place since 2006. It's been promoting this agenda for a very, very long time. And if the slides get circulated later on, I've just put a little link there to the practical guide for ESG integration, because I think it's a good read. But actually, just to call out here things that I can't, just to make it easier for myself, if you look at the goals and the principles, of 1 to 6, incorporating ESG issues into the investment analysis and decision-making process, but be active owners. So this is why I gave the definition of stewardship. Be active owners, not intrusive owners, okay, but be active owners into our ownership policies and practices, and seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues. So the PRI were well out of the blocks way before a lot of the regulatory initiatives that we have seen come through via the EU Action Plan. Okay. So that's my initial intro, and moving then on to what is the role for asset managers, etc., in relation to the EU Action Plan. And this really is a summary of the EU Action Plan, because everything that we've seen from CSDR to SFDR and the taxonomy and so on has been born out of the EU Action Plan. And let's go back, and again, for anyone, this might be elementary to everybody, but I always think it's to remind ourselves. We have the Paris Agreement, and closely aligned to this Paris Agreement, we have the SDGs. You can't divorce the Sustainable Development Goals from the Paris Agreement and the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So what the EU Action Plan then is the regional execution of policy in order to support a regional reaching of the goals contained in the Paris Agreement. And so there's loads of different dimensions here. I don't have time to go through them all. But again, if you get the slides and you can click on those links, you'll go straight to the taxonomy and stuff like that, trying to make it nice and easy for you. But a couple of things I wanted to call out here. And particularly in relation to clarifying asset managers and institutional investors' duties regarding sustainability. The PRI has been there saying you want to be good and you want to be responsible investors. But of course, so much of what's happened and what SFDR has come to shortly is all about is actually to carving out that asset managers, like banks, have a really important role in reorientating capital flows to help organisations towards their net zero. Okay, so we talked about, for example, companies maybe not being caught under CSDR. Well, they certainly will be caught under the supply chain and the corporate sustainable due diligence regulation, which I have a slide on later on. But also, when you think of banks, if you are banking, whether you're a large corporate, whether you are a private company or an SME, remember what the banks are part of this action plan. And I know it's probably not my topic, but I just wanted to pick it up. Because if I'm a bank, if I'm AIB, Bank of Ireland, NatWest, and so on, maybe NatWest because they will be caught under the equivalent UK regime. What banks are being asked to do is public finance cannot support the transition of companies. We need private finance to support that. And we need private finance and banks to identify bankable projects and bank them. Okay, and the critical thing for that is on the other side, these highly regulated banks are regulated by the ECB and the EBA, and the ECB and EBA care about counterparty risk. That's what they think about, counterparty risk. So they need data from you. The banks need data from you to ensure that you are it can enable them to understand that their counterparty risk as regards your physical and transition risk. But anyway, that aside, the key thing about the action plan in terms of my discussion, because I have a tendency to digress, is it's about the asset managers and institutional investors and their role. Okay, and this is about their role in that reorientation, but also in preventing greenwashing. Now, this goes back to my thing about the invisible hand and stewardship. Stewardship came on the agenda very much after 2008. And now what we're seeing is that evolution of stewardship to say, investors, not only you need to be better stewards, we want you to be better stewards in the context of ESG and don't greenwash. So on your side, on the company side, and Ken put it brilliantly this morning, all of the challenges that companies have, on the other side you've got investors with this strong regulatory and policy expectation that they will create investment products that will attract pension fund money, retail money, that they will then channel into companies that are, on a scale from Article 6 to Article 9, depending, Article 9 being purest responsible investing, that actually they meet the criteria. Okay, so these are critical things to consider in the context of asset managers. Okay, so let's think about it and think of the EU Action Plan, and in terms of the executing that plan in the context of the European Union. Okay, they believe that one of the best ways to achieve the goals is to encourage capital to flow, as I've said. But many investors also support this objective, absolutely. And of course, we're all in the business of making money. There is money to be made from the production, from the establishment of good investment funds that invest into investee companies that meet certain criteria. But it's all about the lack of data and the lack of information to compare sustainable investment options. So the EU Action Plan on sustainable finance features a series of these interlinking regulations designed to encourage sustainable investing and to ensure that the right data is there. And a key part of that is the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, SFDR. And SFDR came first. The taxonomy came later, but they're inextricably linked. Why? Because the taxonomy establishes specific environmental criteria related to economic activities for, among others, other things, investment purposes, and thus impacts the product classification. So Ken alluded to it earlier. That's the world asset managers live in. The product classification is directed by the EU taxonomy. And so when they design product and that product actually seeks to have investment objectives, whether it is a purist Article 9, some lesser extent Article 8, or no sustainable agenda in Article 6, the taxonomy is at the core of that, underpinning it all. Okay, so this is a little diagrammatical representation. Okay, so what you see is that wonderful triangle. You see the EU taxonomy at the heart of it, and you see that it's linking up. So underpinning the CSDR will be the taxonomy. Underpinning SFDR will be the taxonomy. EU taxonomy not directly related to banks from an ECB point of view, although it is a useful tool when they're looking at the way that they identify counterparty risks for their underlying, for their customers and so on. And then we have other tools beyond the scope of today, but just in terms of the benchmark regulations and so on. So the world, they're attempting to link it up. And of course, Ken put up that brilliant slide that I'm going to shamelessly rob with his permission and use it in class when he talked about that wonderful gap, because things haven't landed. Now, in an ideal world, when it all lands, okay, when CSDR is over the hump and ISSB comes and the output of EFRAG and so on, we hope that actually there'll be a little bit of clarity there. We hope, but nonetheless, we know where we're trying to get to. And right now, there is information asymmetry, there is information lags and data lags, which is a challenge. Okay. So just remind yourselves in terms of the taxonomy, I won't go into it too much detail, but it's a tool to help investors, companies, issuers and project promoters navigate the transition to low carbon, resilient and resource efficient economy. It sets performance thresholds or technical screening criteria for economic activities. And this is the key thing. They make a substantive contribution to one of the 6 objectives. And a lot of you are dealing with probably 2 of those 6 objectives, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, but there are other 4. And I talk about the correlation between the environmental aspect and social. There's also going to be correlation between some of the other 4 classifications of the taxonomy and your climate adaptation and mitigation strats. And actually, some parts of which may become negated because we realise and recognise that correlation, particularly when we focus on biodiversity. They have to do no significant harm, meet significant safeguards as dictated or as espoused in certain guidelines. Okay, so the taxonomy you probably know well, but I think it's always useful to remind ourselves of it. And SFDR, the big thing about SFDR, the big thing is that it's saying to asset managers, do not greenwash. Okay, we don't want you to greenwash. Don't go out there in your corporate social responsibility statements or on your website and say that you are something that you're not. And SFDR is all about using that taxonomy to make sure that you have criteria to assess investee companies. The fact that there's a lag in what they can provide to you is really problematic for asset managers, but let's park that for a second. But ultimately what we want you to do is get access to that data and be able to opine and within your fund prospectus, the fund financial statements, your website, your approach to sustainable investing and how the product that you're promoting to an underlying investor meets those criteria. Okay. Now, it's really important here that the requirements do not require asset managers to incorporate sustainability into their thinking, but they do require disclosures about actions they are taking, if any, on a number of sustainable investing topics. It's also very interesting, far beyond, I don't want to give you more acronyms, but there was a recent regulation that came out during the summer in relation for, delegated acts for UCITS and alternative investment fund managers, aside from SFDR, saying that these entities have to integrate sustainability risk into their investment decision and investment analysis processes as well. So regardless, even if you're in Article 6, you've got to do that. Okay, so that's a gorgeous diagram. You can look at it later because the clock is ticking down. And but I just want to say, I think it's a nice one because it attempts to join the world. And you'll see, underpinning all of this, you've got the taxonomy. The taxonomy underpins it all. SFDR for the corporates on the right-hand side. You've got SFDR on the other side for the investors. And of course, EFRAG linking up in relation to CSRD. And again, large companies and listed companies. But again, just because you're not cut under CSRD doesn't mean that it isn't going to be really pertinent to you. Okay, so that's a whistle-stop tour of that. And let's think about the evolving nature of stewardship. And I think this is really what excites me and worries me at the same time. And, some points were made that I think are really important. If I even stopped here, I think it's really important to make the point. I mean, I suppose I think it's important that you understand that stewardship by investors and the classification and being constrained by the taxonomy, if you're in Article 9, Ken alluded to it early on, that is the regulatory policy, that is the world that asset managers are operating in, and as a result, we all have to try and deal with that. My call out to the European Commission and my call out to anyone who has a voice at that table would be, at our peril, we avoid the qualitative assessment. Okay, and that is something that probably worries me a little bit more. It's very easy to go to, this is the blueprint. We had Smurfit Kappa there early on. Smurfit Kappa aren't hitting, they're only hitting taxonomy alignment in relation to forestry, therefore it's an exclusion. And that exclusion will have detrimental effects, not only for Smurfit in terms of their access to capital, but also for underlying investors who really should be getting access to a good stock. And so, we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So what I want to do, I would love to see stewardship evolve a little bit more in that space. And interestingly, it's a rhetorical question, but I wonder if the Article 9 funds become so rigid and are so rigid with that taxonomy, does that mean that actually the best place to be is an Article 6 or 8 fund? And is that really the objective that we have? So I think that there's a lot to play for here and a lot of things that will play out. But anyway, in terms of the evolving role, I think that my experience teaching in this space, engaging with the industry that I grew up in, which is the asset management industry, is that the ESG and strats, they're no longer, separate from traditional investment strategies. I mean, even pure, active managers, when Article 6 funds are looking at the impact of the environment on investee companies, they mightn't be looking at the impact of investee companies on the environment, that double materiality, but they're certainly looking at the impact of the environment on investee companies. So we're seeing that being socialised into investment strat. And integrating ESG into the analysis of listed investments is now widespread, and that's clear. There's several drivers, and one of the particular drivers is that there is a significant influx. First of all, we have probably a global pension crisis. You look at Ireland, you look at how many people do not have sufficient pensions. They need access to pensions. But we have a whole new generation that want to invest responsibly and invest for their future responsibly. So we have a lot of flows coming in from pension funds and so on, the biggest players looking to, and the asset management industry wants to seek to fill that gap, okay? So there's a risk to ignoring the ESG factors, both commercially and of course from a regulatory point of view, and the shift in focus on ESG factors from the margin to the mainstream, okay? And that's something that is clearly there, okay? I just mentioned the taxonomy early on. You can take a look at this later on. I mean, these are all things that taxonomy can be used for by investors. I won't go through them line by line. I think that the big thing is that the taxonomy is a useful tool for asset managers to guide those stewardship activities. I worry when I hear someone like of Ken's calibre and experience and position in the industry that he's not getting that dialogue with the asset managers. That is exactly what we don't want. That is exactly what stewardship is not. Okay, and that's something that does worry me. And again, call out to the European Commission to make it clear that we want that. And I know also with the rating agencies and certain things that I see where, and I've seen scenarios whereby, asset managers might vote in an AGM against management's remuneration report, not because in certain circumstances because they were, even though they approved it last year, the remuneration report, that when it brought in a new long-term incentive plan, they voted against again as a way of getting a dig at the company in relation to certain other aspects of governance. I've seen within stewardship policies, asset managers assert that they will vote against the reappointment of a chair if they're not happy with other governance issues. To me, throwing a baby out with the bathwater, are you engaging? Could the chair be the champion? Is this a slow burner? Is it going to take time? And these are the kind of questions that I'd like to see form part of stewardship. Okay, so this is slightly out of date. Apologies for that, but just to kind of give you an idea, I couldn't get my hands on something more in a short time closer, but you'll get a sense of here. The race to net zero continues across Europe, and you'll see the stats. 30 of the UK's FTSE 100 now signed up to the UK's Race to Zero campaign. The emergence of say and climate proposals very, very prominent. Okay, European banks being called out, targeted by climate activists to be better in this space, and not something that I agree with, but the push for exec remuneration and long-term incentive plans to have incentivization around meeting ESG targets. To me, it goes against the spirit of what ESG is about. If you have to incentivize a CEO to meet ESG targets, we've lost the plot. However, it's something that I'm looking forward to talking about in January in Smurfit Business School again, because I think it's an interesting aspect. But again, if you look at, and this is very current, this is just a recent publication on the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, and again, the link is there, and just focus on the 2022 AGM season, and ESG is now without question a mainstream lens to which companies are viewed and assessed. So, I think it's something to just acknowledge and be aware of. So just a couple of things here to give you an idea. We don't have a social taxonomy, but we have media and we have journalists calling out Article 9 funds already because there's, and I'm giving an example of Tesla here. Why? Because Tesla probably, not a lover of the CEO myself, but nevertheless, hits a lot of environmental criteria. But interestingly, in this particular article, which the link is there for you, Article 9 funds who invest in Tesla are called out because apparently 4,000 current and former Black employees are taking a racial abuse case against Tesla. Okay, and so the question has been asked: why are they not Article 9 compliant? Why are they aligned with the objectives of an Article 9 fund? So it'll give you an indication of the kind of pressure that investors or the asset managers have been put under to be as clean as clean as clean. Okay. Another here is the college of BlackRock. BlackRock have done, they're front runners. They're part of that front pack in terms of what they're trying to do in relation to ESG. So I'm not putting up this here to shame BlackRock at any stretch of the imagination. I'm putting it up here to show you that even people who are organizations, asset managers who are putting a lot of effort into the areas of ESG will get called out. And again, what was the issue here? It was the supply chain of an investee company, the supply chain of the investee company that got them caught out. Okay, briefly mention, I know I'm out of time, but I'm going to just take a couple of minutes. The EU proposal for new directors' duties, rules and corporate sustainability due diligence. And this came out kind of the Commission adopted a proposal back in February 2022, but the aim is to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behaviour and to anchor human rights and environmental consideration in companies' operations. And again, for this kind of links into the supply chain. And again, when you think about from linking the world, linking the ecosystem, this is about investors being able to actually rely on the integrity of data they're getting from their companies because those companies are obliged to provide this data. So nobody is off the hook. Okay, so in the couple of seconds I'm going to, I have to finish. I suppose I want to reiterate a couple of things. Sometimes I get a little bit disillusioned when I'm on listening to webcams. Not today, but any stretch of the imagination. It was a brilliant morning. But I've heard people say, "Oh, ESG is all about data," and data is a piece of the puzzle and it's really, really important and we have to seek to generate the data. But I cannot tell you how important it is to know your purpose. As companies, whether you're part of a supply chain that doesn't fall under CSDR or you are directly CSDR, it's directly applicable to you. The worst thing that you could do is back your truck into some data blueprint that an investor has created for you. Okay, you need to know your purpose. You need to know, what your purpose is in terms of your business, what you're trying to achieve, who your stakeholders are, and how, and in terms of those stakeholders, how does that stakeholder responsibility, how when you put your arms around those stakeholders, is it reflected in your strategy and your risk appetite and so on. And when we know these things, and I know this sometimes can feel very intangible to people, but believe me, you've got to make it tangible. It can be tangible, it is tangible, okay? And I think that, that is the key point, and I think Ken made it earlier and he made it brilliantly, so I don't really need to reiterate that. You're reflecting and you're integrating the E and S factors. In other words, what in delivery of our product, in the production of our product, in the distribution of our product, what impact are we having on the environment? What impact are we having on society? Where's the correlation? How do you manage our supply chain? Know and influence your supply chain. Create accountability through your service level agreements, to your KPIs. Do it early, because by doing that, for supply chains that maybe are taking a while to catch up, through your service level agreements and KPIs, you can force that agenda, okay? Ken said it brilliantly again, stole my thunder, builds a narrative, tell a story. For those asset managers that have within their either their active management or indeed through their Article 6 and 8 fund, maybe more capacity to engage, build a narrative, talk to them about your transition. The one thing I would say as well, avoid reporting silos. And I think that, to be honest, was pretty well covered here. I think it's really important that somebody over here doing a corporate social responsibility statement and the CFO over here, those days are over. It's all inextricably linked, and I think that's been covered well enough. And then I suppose know your audience and know in terms of your disclosure that the data that you need to provide. And again, I've mentioned from a green investing point of view, from the SFDR point of view, the taxonomy underpins that, and that will give you great insight, particularly if you're targeting that purist Article 9 investment, that gives you a very good insight. Okay, so. I didn't do too bad there now. Thank you for your time. Thanks so much. Sorry, Gavin.
I've known Margaret for quite a long time. I should have given her the hour rather than the 30. But anyway.
20 minutes, no good, no good.
Again, I want to give the opportunity, if anybody does want to ask Margaret maybe one or two questions, and again, to see if there's any questions that are coming from our virtual attendees. I suppose a thought that occurred to me, I view this, the EU Green, it's a massive nudge exercise, basically. It's trying to get the market to do the heavy lifting for the policy they want to achieve, which is fine. But just a point you made there, and it did come up in Ken's as well, which is, if this is to work, it's got to be, if I can use the phrase, self-sustainable, and it's about dialogue and flexibility and stewardship being something active rather than tick box.
Yeah.
But then you have the fact that this is being driven by laws and regulations and lists of criteria by which you get into Article 8 or Article 9 or whatever. How are we going to square that circle?
Yeah, I lie in bed thinking about it, if I'm honest, Kevin. I think of a time, say where Article 9 funds maybe are in place for a long period of time and people look at their exclusion tactics and maybe you realise what return was lost for the underlying investor and maybe was it really worth it. I think that there will be a relook at European Commission level maybe to see, So I think that there are real challenges ahead. I think that whatever happens, even looking at that kind of puristic taxonomy aligned, and again, to exclude someone like Smurfit because they only have one aspect of alignment, to me is treacherous almost. So I think that whatever happens, the capacity of the asset management industry, either directly through the bigger players, like your BlackRock, Legals and Reynolds, SSGAs, those bigger players, and they can be active stewards, but also there are other forums for stewardship where we actually are having good engagement about that transition and how, but I think that is a fear of mine, that we will lose the very essence of what stewardship is about, and we will be, because at the end of the day, particularly when you're trying to join that ecosystem, Kevin, and we're thinking about investing, and I'm as passionate about all of the Paris Agreement as the next person, we also have to think about the role of the asset manager in enabling us to save for our retirement as well. Okay, so we have to make sure that all links up. So I would hate to see that qualitative aspect of stewardship, I would hate to see it go away. But I think that in the context of the deep pockets, it's really the bigger players that have that capacity, Kevin, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, okay. There's one question that's come through on Slido, which is actually not necessarily relevant to ESG at all, but maybe it's looking to your wider expertise in the area of corporate governance. So it just says, earlier there was a question about audit committees and basically the regulation of audit committees or what structure that should have. So do you see value in having audit committees supervised by an external regulator?
100%.
And as a regulator, I'm always conscious of the fact that we want good people to come in and be on audit committees. And also there is the corporate governance thing, which is the board of directors are ultimately responsible. Do you have any specific view, though, on audit committees being supervised, more intrusively by an external regulator?
100% no, would be my view. Okay, 100% no. And I think that the reason I say that is that when I look at the evolution, I mean, I grew up in the financial services space, and, I see the evolution of governance going in a totally different way to anything that I would promote, the philosophy that I would promote. I think that what we need is good guidance, what we need is good support of audit committees. What we don't need is a objective assessment, maybe, and I'm not suggesting that would be the case, but objective assessment that we see, that we can see in other regulated areas as to what good looks like. What we want as an audit committee, what we want is to attract directors who are walking into that boardroom at either board level or audit committee level and saying, I am here to act honestly and responsibly. Okay, I want to act with integrity, act honestly and responsibly in the best interest of this company. Will things happen on my watch? Yes, they will. Okay, and I think the point was made earlier on. I think that I need to learn from those mistakes, and I think that point was really important. That we should learn from our mistakes as well, because nobody should expect infallibility from directors. So my concern in a highly regulated space is that defensive directing, the fear of taking risks, the fear of actually, because that's what we're in the business of. Once you're on a board and you're running a company, you're in the business of taking risk. Some more explicit than others because you have banks and insurance companies, the nature of the business. You think of a bank, you think of an audit committee of a bank. I don't sell product as a bank. We don't sell product. We underwrite risky assets. Okay, our asset side of the balance sheet is risky. That's what we do. And we do it in a whole form of uncertainty, with a macroeconomic environment that's really, really uncertain, and things that evolve over time, and the need for operational resilience when COVID hits and so on. So it's a constantly changing, evolving environment. So for me, I worry that we can go too far. The pendulum of regulation will go so far that we are focusing on regulatory compliance, which is really important, but we become regulatory-led, Kevin. And what we want in the boardroom is we want our organisations to be regulatory compliant, but not regulatory-led. And my concern is if that is that intrusion, that the audit committee could become very regulatory-led, which is very different.
Okay.
So I would be a no from me. Okay.
Take that view on board. Okay, I want to join you as well, again, rather, in thanking Margaret. That was brilliant. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.